Welcome from the Nasrec Centre. Now, the second day of the G20 got off to a rather polished start, and that's probably because the Johannesburg Leaders Declaration was signed before 9 o'clock yesterday. That is pretty unusual. That has opened up the runway for world leaders to really get down to business. Bilateral, trilateral meetings have been underway, including deals. And the fact that the United States is not here at all, delegations are saying it's made the whole process a whole lot freer. Now, before we project to what's expected today and what's likely to be done with this declaration, let's look back at all the drama and the excitement that happened yesterday at the very first G20 summit on African soil.
The time has come for South Africa to take up its rightful and responsible place in the community of nations. Today, as we open this G20 Leaders Summit, South Africa is deeply aware of the profound responsibility that membership of the community of nations places upon us. We also understand the responsibility of being entrusted with the presidency of the G20. In the execution of its task as president of the G20, South Africa has, throughout the past year, through its stewardship of some 130 meetings in various parts of South Africa, in other countries on the African continent, and beyond our shores, including at the United Nations, we have sought to undertake this task with care, with dignity, and with diligence. We have sought at all times to preserve the integrity and the stature of the G20, a premier forum of international economic cooperation. From its initial focus on broad macroeconomic issues, the G20 is now engaged on matters such as trade, sustainable development, health, education, science and technology, agriculture, energy, the environment, climate change, and many others. It has therefore broadened its scope as the challenges of the peoples of the world requires that they should be addressed. As the G20 countries, we understand that progress on each and all of these issues is a necessary condition for strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. In pursuit of and in conformity with the founding mission of the G20, South Africa adopted the theme Solidarity, Equality, and Sustainability for its presidency in 2025. It is essential that we break down divisions of economic status, of gender, of race, and geography. Sustainability involves meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. As a founding member of the G20, South Africa has sought to ensure that the development priorities of the Global South and the African continent find expression firmly and permanently on the agenda of the G20. This is important not only for the people of Africa and the Global South. It is vital for global stability and security, alleviating resource pressures, managing population movements, and reducing the risk of conflict. We seek stability because it attracts investment, it improves planning and reduces the risk of global economic shocks. And we prioritize inclusive and vibrant markets because they are able to drive innovation and efficiency. Thriving economies lift people out of poverty. They encourage greater investment and trade, and they generate the revenue needed to invest in public goods. The threats facing humanity today, from escalating geopolitical tensions, global warming, pandemics, energy and food insecurity, to inequality, unemployment, extreme poverty, and armed conflict, jeopardize our collective future. It is therefore essential that we make greater and faster progress towards the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. We welcome the Seville Commitment adopted in June this year, which sets forth a renewed global framework for financing for development. We must use this framework to catalyze development investments at scale in developing economy countries. We must continue the reform of the international financial architecture, ensuring that institutions are strengthened and are more inclusive and are equipped to meet the challenges both of the present and the future. At the beginning of our G20 presidency, we identified 4 high-level priorities. Firstly, we focus on action to strengthen disaster resilience and response. While climate-induced natural disasters affect countries around the world, they have a particularly devastating impact on countries that cannot afford the costs of recovery and rebuilding. We have agreed that it is essential for the global community, international finance institutions, development banks, and the private sector to scale up post-disaster construction. Secondly, we agreed that we must take action to ensure debt sustainability for low-income countries. The G20 needs to renew its efforts to advance debt sustainability while at the same time laying emphasis on those countries in the global south that are suffering from debt repayments. Thirdly, we said we should mobilize finance for a just energy transition, increasing the quality and quantity of climate finance flows to developing economy countries. Fourthly, we emphasized the importance of harnessing critical minerals for inclusive growth and sustainable development through the beneficiation of the minerals at the place of extraction. In addition to these 4 priorities, we have prioritized issues of inclusive economic growth, industrialization, inequality, unemployment, and security and artificial intelligence. As this is the first G20 Leaders Summit to be held in Africa, it carries the hopes and must reflect the aspirations of the people of this continent and of the world. We should not allow anything to diminish the value, the stature, and the impact of the first African G20 presidency. This G20 Leaders Summit has a responsibility not to allow the integrity and the credibility of the G20 to be weakened. In fact, from this summit, we should have a sense that the G20 has been strengthened. We thank all delegations that have worked together with us in good faith to produce a worthy G20 outcome document for this historic leaders meeting. The G20 underscores the value of the relevance of multilateralism. It recognizes that the challenges that we face can only be resolved through cooperation, collaboration, and partnership. The adoption of the declaration from the summit sends an important signal to the world that multilateralism can and does deliver. It sends a message of hope and solidarity across the world. It tells the world that as the leaders of the G20, we will keep fast to our solemn pledge to leave no person, no community, and no country behind.
The reason for us picketing here is to send a message across, to the leaders of different countries, but especially to the leader of this country, that we have a burning issue, which is immigration, and he's not touching on it. I was fortunate to attend the social summit, and part of the things we've spoken about is immigration, and we submitted our thoughts, and it was supposed to be tabled out in documents, and I'm hoping that it's still there. They will be discussing that. But what we're doing today is that we are picketing. We want other countries to know that these are the issues that we are facing as South Africans. Can they be part of that meeting? But we are denied. We are being placed 2 kilometers away from where the actual event is, which is not fair.
Here, I saw you were tear gassed and pepper sprayed.
The sad thing is that the force that they're showing to us as South Africans, they can't show it to criminals. That's why we have a Madanga Commission today. When they're supposed to do the right thing to the criminals, they don't do it. Some of us were arrested for fighting crime, for fighting illegality that's happening in the country. We went to take people to the police station who are illegal in the country, and some people were arrested. What's the job of the police if they can't protect the citizens?
So quite an extraordinary day yesterday. I mean, firstly, the fact that we're seeing a G20 summit for the first time ever on African soil, the anger outside where we are standing, and the tear gas. And here, relatively calm throughout the day, including or rather excluding about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when the heavens opened and a true Gauteng storm battered the rooftop. Nobody could hear themselves think. And I said this yesterday, I'm going to say it again because it is quite sublime for there to be good coffee at these media venues. And there was good coffee, real African hospitality. So that's another layer to what has been seen as relative success. The fact that we've never seen before a declaration being issued so early on the first day rather than wrapping up the summit. I'm going to bring in Sanusha Naidu, who's also been keeping an eye on this. I mean, that is quite extraordinary, isn't it? It says a lot about unity and understanding and possibly a vision forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jane, what was really interesting, or what's really important and significant, is that it represents a moment, a historical moment where let's see what comes out of the review of the G20 at 20, because this is where South Africa is hosting. It's hosting towards at the end of a cycle of first summits. And so we're going into a second cycle. And when the G20 was constituted in 1999 or 97, 98, after the Asian financial crisis, it wasn't a heads of state summit. It was the financial ministers that came together to deal with the currency issues that were then plaguing and impacting on the global architecture and the volatility. When the 2008-2009 financial crisis happened, and when certain of the developed economies could no longer sustain their own monetary policy or could sustain their capital because they were becoming bankrupt because of the banks, it became a heads of state summit. So the crisis of the G20 is born out of crisis, it is defined by crisis, and it will continue in crisis. The second point to make is every 10 years we seem to have a crisis globally. 97, 98, 2007, 2008. So we kind of now in that period where we have to look at what this crisis is coming in terms of this. And one of the key things that I've taken out of that declaration is around debt. Now we're talking a lot about debt sustainability for the African continent. It's talking about that, how it impacts on cost of borrowing, how credit rating methodologies impact what you can borrow, how much you can borrow, and the cost of that borrowing. Because if you have a negative credit rating, very much like when you go to a bank, they do a profiling of you. And they see, are you high risk, medium risk, low risk? At the moment, Africa is high risk. And so the cost of borrowing is inflated by credit rating methodologies, which is minus triple C, minus triple B, and whatever. And it's also influenced by the fact that you have currency volatility, particularly where countries like Zambia that are basically commodity dependent on things like copper. When that copper price starts to become volatile, it creates a volatility in the market. The other thing that we have to unpack here is that the G20 also has to deal with issues of the international currency market. Where do we have our commodities being defined in terms of pricing? It's not where you actually have source of commodities.
No.
It's actually determined in New York, London, those stock exchanges. And so when the price, when there's a run on your rand, so when the rand becomes volatile against the dollar, what are the factors that influence that? It could be anything. It could be that there's an ANC problem, it affects the dollar. There could be that people are shorting, so they actually speculate against the rand and they create the dollar going up. And then when you do that, you buy at low and you sell at high, which is really, it's a modern form of gambling. One of the academics called it casino capitalism. So, and then the third point to make about that, it affects how much you can buy. So we feel it every single day in South Africa, where we have no control over the price of petrol, over the price of petroleum or Brent crude oil. It either goes up and when it's coming down. So our volatility in markets is also what impacts on debt, how it actually creates capital outflow in terms of debt servicing, and of course doesn't actually bring back to development financing into the continent. Last point on this, I think, is very important to bear in mind, and that is the question around how do we deal with issues that are becoming more and more about pandemics. It's everything about pharmaceuticals, and we saw this during COVID. We saw what the vaccine did to countries in Africa, where we had the money to pay, but it became a hierarchy of who gets it first. So in other words, whose lives matters more than others. And I think this declaration talks to some of that, but it also talks to the global reform, the global reform of the multilateral, and we talk about the UN Security Council. I don't know if you earlier saw a big delegation, a big lot of cameras focusing on the DG of the WTO. That's one of those bigger issues as well, because right now the WTO is in limbo because of the US basically
That's
disabling
the World Health Organization.
World Trade Organization.
World Trade Organization.
Because the dispute resolution mechanism and the adjudication mechanism has always been about how you create the kind of trade liberalization and grievance that comes in. If there's a grievance, you bring it to that body. The US has under the Trump presidency, I think it was the first presidency, he actually disabled it, because he said it's against our interests. It's always making us be as if we have our backs against the wall. As a result of that, trade disputes in the WTO can be brought, but the country that's bringing it can have a ruling, but the country who is actually being ruled against has to now wait. So you have a limbo. And so the DG of the WTO actually now has to think about what is the essence of the WTO. These are another multilateral issues that need to be looked at, and then of course Agenda 2030 and so forth.
All right, what you and I were chuckling about a little bit earlier on was the final paragraph in the declaration. Elaborate what we found so amusing about it.
Well, I think we have to actually look at this paragraph and see what it says. But what it says essentially is, we thank South Africa for hosting the G20 Summit. We look forward to the US's G20 presidency of the G20, and we will meet again in the UK in 2027.
Very briefly, we know that Donald Trump was glued to the TV apparently yesterday, taking in everything that was happening here. He must be rather annoyed that a declaration went ahead without him, and people are saying that it's opened up business. It's been a lot easier to talk about business here. Could he scupper what we've achieved here?
It's never been done before, but in the world of Donald Trump, we don't know what he thinks, and we don't know how he will basically at the last minute try and make sure that it's all about me, myself, and I, because that's what it is. So there will be attempts. I don't think we should be completely, oblivious to those attempts that they will try to scupper this declaration. But again, the question is that that last paragraph tries to, in my interpretation, says, well, you're going to have a presidency. It's not going to be an easy one under the US. And so we're going to go through motions. But we'll meet again in 2027 under the UK. And I think this means that whatever happens next year, if he is to scupper this declaration, there's no formality in the G20 that says, as much as I object to this, it cannot be adopted. So it has been adopted. Now to change it, you'll have to go back and get that consensus, in my interpretation. Okay. You can actually, I think the way they may, if his advisors are thinking about this, the way they may go about this is to then not give ventilation to certain things, because we have heard from his from the administration in the US that they're going back to basics. They don't want this big bulky G20 and with all these meetings or whatever. And back to basics means they're going back to how to save the banks.
And let's leave it there. Sunisha Naidu, thank you very much. I'm going to be talking to you as the president wraps up sometime around 1 o'clock. So a lot of the leaders will be leaving a little bit later today, tomorrow, and we know that the Border Management Authority has been keeping pretty busy, and we're going to be speaking. Very good afternoon to you. And I don't have my glasses. Mike Masia. You know, we've actually never met in the flesh, but I've spoken to you on the radio many times. Yeah. And you're a hard-working man, because whenever I speak to you, you are there on the border, you're checking cars out, you're checking what's happening. Tell us what's happening today, what your expectations are for today and tomorrow.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Jane. Maybe just to indicate that, yes, we have now started to, shift gears. We are now in the exit mode. I can also confirm that since yesterday, after the signing of the declaration, we did start to see some of the heads of state starting to exit. For instance, the Prime Minister of the UK had already exited. The head of state for Spain already left yesterday. We also had the Irish head of state also leaving yesterday, together with some of the other delegates. For example, Qatar, the UAE had also started leaving yesterday. This morning we had the Namibian head of state also exiting. So as we speak now, we are busy, very much ready, to be able to process them out. We are aware that the majority of them will start leaving tonight, and some of them in the morning. But otherwise, from where I sit, we have all of the teams ready. From here, I'll also be going to OR Tambo just to make sure that everything goes according to plan.
I know Keir Starmer, for one, the UK leader, had to get out because people were rather angry with him because he's been on, I think, more than 40 trips since he's taken over. But anyway, what was the vibe that you got from people? Did they seem satisfied with the way travel, the way their travel went, and going through the processes, passports, all of that?
Yeah, yes. I mean, in terms of the work that we do, the response, or I would say the reaction that we get is that people are very much happy. You will remember when we do the processing in this kind of context, what happens is there will be what we call the A-suite delegates. These are the delegates that comes together with the president. Most of the time it will be 1 + 3, 5. In this instance, those ones, they don't go into the normal processing area. We process them within the state protocol lounge. So on that basis, they went in there and they got processed. When it comes to the actual heads of state, we don't even bring them into the environment. We just take them straight into the hotel. And of course, we are able to then process them in terms of the paperwork. So on that basis, the people were very much happy. When it comes to what we call the B-suite, this is the second layer of the delegates accompanying the president. We take them to the normal processing area. In this instance, we had very dedicated lanes at OR Tambo, for instance, just for the people coming for the G20. Same in terms of Lanseria International Airport, together with Waterkloof Air Force Base. So on that basis, there was no much queues. I mean, I can give you a typical example. We had to bring staff from other ports just to come into these 3 areas to come and assist us. We have 48 cubicles at OR Tambo just on the entry side. Under normal circumstances, we are not able to fill those because of capacity problems. But this time around, we had them completely, being taken care of 4 of those are just for port health responsibility, and 44 of those were for immigration. That is why there was no queue at all in terms of what we had to do during this period.
And I've experienced often a rather grumpy reception when you come to Johannesburg. Did you say to everybody, best foot forward, smile, welcome, African hospitality?
Yeah, you know, number one, you will remember that we don't necessarily have to do something for one event. We need to do something that is supposed to be the culture of the organization.
Yeah.
Yes, we have started as the Border Management Authority to take our immigration teams into what you'll call your customer service training. We actually partnered with South African Airways, and they've been helping us, particularly for OR Tambo. We make people understand that they are the face of South Africa. People will have the first impression of South Africa by the manner in which they respond to them when they arrive. So on that basis, yes, indeed, we had to say to the colleagues, you are law enforcement authority, but at the same time, you have a customer service angle that you must actually provide. So yes, indeed, the colleagues did not disappoint. They were very much welcoming, they were very much smiling, and they were able to receive everybody into the country.
And I need you to just hold it together a little bit longer because it's nearly over. Mike, always very good to talk to you, and thank you for the work that you do.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jane.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right, so yesterday, as you saw in our earlier clip, there were some protests outside. I mean, whenever there's any G20, G7, any of these type of gatherings where you get Davos, where you get world leaders getting together, there are people who are angry about so much that is happening, that they feel as though they are not being included, and it's a pretty fair comment in many areas, particularly here in Africa. Alpha Ramashwana, EWN reporter, he was in the thick of it yesterday. I'm sure that your TikTok is already trending with those little bits and pieces that you added.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you might have seen the protest yesterday. Some of them are back here today outside the Nasrec Expo Center, really protesting against the G20 Summit with groups like Operation Dudula and the MK Party, the first organization protesting against illegal immigration, MK Party protesting against unemployment crisis in the country, believing that the South African government needs to focus on its own domestic issues before hosting international gatherings such as these. So it got violent yesterday, but today not many of them came out, just a few of them which we can actually count with our hands.
Oh, really? I mean, that seems to be a thing in South Africa, doesn't it? That we start off with this gusto and then it's like, yeah, bit over it now.
Yeah, I mean, I think they underestimated the preparations that police and other law enforcement agencies had done for this event. I mean, they're protecting heads of state, prime ministers from all over the world. They're not just protecting perhaps councillors from one municipality. It's a big deal. And so you would remember that Nat Joins is leading security checks for this, which is the military, the South African National Defence Force, which is South African Police Service, intelligence. So it's an intelligence-driven operation. So police were very prepared to deal with any violent clash, and they did do that yesterday. And I think because of that police intervention yesterday, they didn't show up today.
Talk us through what happened, why tear gas was fired, and I believe a few arrests too.
Yeah, so government has allocated protesters 4 points or 4 places in and around the Nasrec precinct where they can protest. Not too close to the Nasrec Expo Center where the G20 Summit is currently happening, because also they have to give space to the international delegates to enter and arrive without any disruptions or security risks. And so those 4 points, MK Party and Operation Dudula were protesting at one of them yesterday. And they told them not to move away from those designated protesting zones. But they tried to move and to take their protest to the highway, which is Corner Chris Honey Road and Nasrec Road, which is where the road that they're using on a daily basis. And police refused. They warned them not to do it. And once they did, they started deploying tear gas and pepper spray, which then turned into a violent clash. Some Operation Dudula members fighting back against the police, but of course there were many police officers there, and they managed to keep the protesters in order. So one police officer was injured in the altercation with Operation Dudula. The leader of Operation Dudula, Zandile Dawula, was injured. She was pepper sprayed. I mean, you would have seen the videos of her in pain, trying to recover from the pepper spray that she was affected by. And
she was quite outspoken as well, wasn't she?
She was quite outspoken. I mean, she is the reason that Operation Tutula was here, saying that she doesn't believe that South Africa should be focusing on the G20 summit or hosting or impressing the international community. She believes that South Africa should currently focus on addressing unemployment, the immigration crisis, illegal immigrants. You would remember that they were protesting some weeks ago, blocking access to foreign nationals, illegal foreign nationals at hospitals. And she believes that such issues need to be sorted out before we can even start thinking about growing our footprint in the international community. So she was very outspoken.
I mean, they're not alone. All of us, I think, feel a little bit frustrated that Johannesburg is tidied up. I mean, we're happy that it's been tidied up, but the fact that so often South Africans' voices are not heard, their desperation, the lack of electricity, the potholes, and yet when these big leaders come, we know that it's an ego thing, right? We don't want them to see the true state of the decay here. So you can understand the frustration. Should be South Africans first.
I mean, I'll take you back to March 2025 when President Cyril Ramaphosa visited the Johannesburg City Council, where the mayor of Johannesburg and his executive met with cabinet. And Ramaphosa told the mayor of Johannesburg, Tata Murero, that he's not happy with the state of the city. He mentioned traffic lights that are not working, street lights that are off at night. In fact, he referred to the city as a dark city because it was just so dark at night.
Yeah.
And fast forward, November 2025, we're hosting the G20 Summit. The CBD is clean. Informal traders are operating within designated trading zones. Traffic lights are working. Street lights are on. It just shows that when there is political will to get things done, they will do it. So the question that people are now asking, the question that we've been asking the city, is that are you doing this? Did you do this specifically because you know you're hosting the international community? Why didn't they have the same drive to clean up the city when residents were complaining, when we as journalists kept on covering the stories about how the traffic lights are not working? Why only now? But they maintain that they're going to maintain this even beyond the G20 Leaders Summit. I think that's going to be interesting to see.
Let's hold them to it. And let's hope that this cleanup gives us a fresh start in the country, that we can build on from this, because now we know what we're capable of. I mean, we were just talking, even this media center, I was talking to a couple of foreign journalists and they were saying it really is an indication of how seriously South Africa has taken this, that they've looked after everybody, that there's a free flow, free access to everybody. And Alpha, I'm going to let you go and keep an eye on what's happening out there for us. Alpha Ramashwana, thank you very much for that. So, we know when it comes down to many of the issues in Africa in particular, it all comes down to minerals, access to minerals, the proxy wars that are constantly being fought over minerals. I mean, we've got a massive problem that minerals are taken from our soil and they are being cleaned elsewhere. And then we buy it back at a premium. So something is going horribly wrong there. We know that the DRC, it's home of cobalt, and the proxy wars that are being fought there with Tshisekedi and his government really not caring what's happening. So that the only people who are benefiting from mineral wealth are not the man and the woman on the street, but it's the politicians and the big nationals. Malaika is an expert on this, as in one of your many expertise. The G20, could there be some kind of policy understanding, agreement going forward when it comes to the minerals issue in Africa and tackling it?
Look, I mean, I think that it's going to be quite a bit difficult, especially when you look over the past few months. For example, one of the biggest producers, or a country with one of the largest deposits of minerals in South Africa, in Africa rather, is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Yep. But just a few months ago, the DRC began, discussions and making a deal with the United States to get its raw critical minerals. In exchange for security, basically for security guarantees for the DRC, because of course you know that there is a conflict happening, particularly in the eastern region of the DRC, which is also conflict linked to to mineral wealth and mineral resources and so on. So I do think that, individual countries are making their own deals, and sometimes making deals, and quite often, in fact, making deals that are not in the interest of those countries themselves, but of the region broadly. Take, for example, Sudan. Sudan is the largest exporter of gold to the United Arab Emirates. And you see now the situation that Sudan finds itself in, with warring, in fact, it's got the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, warring factions, which is also linked to minerals, and particularly to gold and gold exports and so on. So I think we are seeing a lot of countries making deals in their own national interests, but also we are seeing continuously, as we have seen over the decades, that minerals on the African continent really bring about a lot of conflict that involves outsiders. And because there are local, players who are benefiting from that kind of conflict, it makes it quite very difficult for us to reach a consensus in which governments themselves would, be able to have a clear and coherent and united vision and agenda for minerals.
Do you think the fact that this G20 has been hosted on African soil here in South Africa, with South Africa holding the presidency, that it could raise this issue in a way that could lead to breaking the status quo?
So I think that the issue of minerals on the African continent is linked to many other issues. So it's linked to issues of water security, it's linked to issues of debt. It's debt on the continent. It's also linked to issues of security broadly, So I don't think that the issue of, and I think one of the things that has been happening over time, which is quite unfortunate and not necessarily very progressive, is that we are thinking and looking at minerals separate to every other issue that they affect. So you can't, on the African continent, deal with the issue of, for example, mineral beneficiation unless you deal with issues of security, conflict, and violence, because a lot of the conflict that is happening on the continent is directly linked to conflicts arising from mineral wealth, competition for minerals, contestation for minerals. And so I think that we need to be quite multidisciplinary in our approach, multi-sectoral in the approach of thinking around how do we harness the wealth and the potential of mineral beneficiation on the continent, but to do so not only looking at minerals as it were, but also looking at minerals and other linked areas of economies and political life.
I mean, one of the I find it gobsmacking problems is that the minerals are found here and they're sent to Asia, to Europe, to the Middle East to be cleaned, and then we buy it back paying a premium. So how did we even get to that point?
Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why one of the biggest conversations around issues of mineral beneficiation is around the establishment of infrastructure that would allow us to process our own minerals here. In fact, here in South Africa, the Gauteng provincial government, for example, established there at OR Tambo a jewelry manufacturing and processing plant, right? And I think we need much more of those across the continent, much more of those, because as you correctly say, Jane, the idea that minerals are extracted from the land on the African continent, taken to Switzerland, to Dubai and everywhere else, polished there, processed there, and brought back here and sold at a premium. And even more than that, they are sold back to people who, number one, cannot afford to have these minerals, but also the damage that is done in the mining process. You see, here in Johannesburg, we have seen the damage that has been done by mining companies who extract resources from the city, but also just as across South Africa broadly, and who leave environmental damage and do not do anything about it. So it's not even just an issue about the fact that, our minerals are being processed elsewhere. It's also about the fact that in the process of extraction, our own natural and even built infrastructure, and really our resources like water, like land, and so on, are being seeing quite a lot of destruction. And I think that one of the things that is certainly very important is investment in the infrastructure for the processing of minerals. It's not sustainable. It cannot still be sustainable on the African continent in 2025 that governments are still sending raw minerals out of the continent and bringing them back as finished processed goods that are costing even much more. But it's also at the heart of why we are seeing so many foreign players involved in conflicts on the African continent, because they want the raw material. The raw material that gets out of Sudan, gold gets out raw from Sudan and gets to be processed in the UAE, in Dubai, in all parts of the world. And I think that's one of the real issues that we need to start thinking very seriously about the financing pathway towards this beneficiation that we often speak about.
I mean, what I love about the G20 being here, well, the first one on Africa soil, but I mean, I know that, you know, being an anchor, when you go on a story and you actually go to a place, you understand it better, isn't it? When you're looking into locals' eyes, you get a feeling and you can understand. So hopefully this will open up some sort of change, some sort of thought process, because the problem is these big companies, these big multinational are making so much money, and when they leave, they don't have to clean up, as you say. So to break that, like the rhino horn kind of thing, to break something that is so successful is hard. There has to be an incentive, an alternative.
So look, one of the things, I mean, you know, we're talking now about minerals, but this issue also extends to issues around debt, for example. One of the key issues that have come out of this G20, and it's been a key issue even in the previous G20 leaders meeting in Rio de Janeiro, was the demand for the reduction of debt in Africa. Now, one of the reasons why debt is we're not even moving the needle at all on issues of debt, for example, is because of the complexity and multiplicity of creditors to African countries. Because quite a lot of people think that the debt is only owed to multilateral institutions like your World Bank and so on. But there are also private commercial interests that are involved there. You've got private creditors that are involved there. You've got bondholders, you've got private shareholders and all of that, right? And so when you want to reduce debt, it now begins to affect their own shareholding, their own bottom line. And even more frustratingly is that a lot of these enterprises, even these individuals, are not brought into the conversation about debt reduction, right? They don't sit, there is no part of the institution of the G20 that sits with these private shareholders and private lenders and private creditors to deal with this issue of debt reduction. And so you see the pushback then in that regard. And I think, as you correctly say, a lot of people who are benefiting from the plundering of minerals on the African continent would want to see an incentive. But I mean, in the context where communities are really being, and I think, as you are saying, people, when they come here and they see what is happening in communities, whether or not, we expect, people to have, and particularly in the global north, who benefit so much from the plundering of the global south, whether or not we expect them to have almost like a moral inclination to do well is one thing. But I think it does become important for them to see what it does when, action is not being done on things like, mineral extraction and communities are left without water or contaminated water sources. Land is being degraded, so people cannot make food. People can't. I think they begin to see the complete picture of what something is, that might seem like it's just one thing, it's extracting minerals. But what you then begin to see is that it affects an entirety of the life of people. And I think that might be something that perhaps the global north needs to see more of, to understand really the implications, that it's not just about minerals, it's about food security, it's about water security, it's about health, public health, and it's about so many other issues that in fact are part of some of the key salient action plans for the G20.
How concerned are you about, now the baton goes over to the US, they hold the presidency, obviously they weren't here. We know what Donald Trump feels about the environment. He doesn't care, he'll frack away, he'll do whatever it is, he'll trawl the seas to get whatever it is that he needs. Could he destroy what little movement we've made in that direction, in the minerals area?
You know what, I think that the world broadly, we and I think it's one of the things that we saw with the declaration yesterday and the adoption of the declaration, right, is that multilateralism can work. But more than the fact that it can work is that the countries that are represented in the G20 constitute over 80% of the global population and the global economy, right? And I think that the idea that the whims of a single individual can decide the fate of a multilateral institution is something that G20 member states and even all other members outside the G20 must fight very hard against. Because evidently we have seen that, at least domestically, Donald Trump has been able to make a lot of reversals, but there it makes sense because, he's the president, he can make those kinds of decisions. But in a multilateral institution, there has to be much greater pushback. And if that can happen, then it will be very difficult for him single-handedly to, in fact, to reverse some of the gains that have been made. But of course, if the US government decides that its priorities will not be, climate change and all of that, at the end of the day, he still has got obligations that have come as a result of agreements by other member states and which have been adopted as declarations, even from Brazil to here.
I like Bilateral. Thank you very much. Such an important topic, a devastating one for the continent, and now it really is up to Africa to get its house in order, right? I mean, so often Africa is looked down upon, is patronized, is a dumping ground. We've had this opportunity here now to open the world's eyes to what South Africa and what Africa has. It's not the begging bowl of the world. We've got to do more than that. And we have to put our foot down. Can you imagine if we were able to control those minerals, and that mineral wealth was able to go back to communities who desperately need it. John Perlman, I know you know this chap. I think it's still morning, isn't it? Good morning,
still morning,
John.
just for another 10 minutes. Morning to you, Jane. Morning to the viewers.
John, I know that you've been keeping an eye on international media, amongst other things,
Right.
and I'm intrigued to know, what is the main story that's come out? Is it the early declaration? Is it Trump? What is it?
So I think the thing is, there isn't really one main story, because I've looked at quite a range of different countries and the way they're covering it, and the emphasis is very, very different depending on where that country is in the world and so on. Where there is consensus, well, let me say this first: the US. Certainly the major newspapers, and I googled Fox News G20.
Yeah.
Well, there's not a lot there, but there's not a huge amount in the major US newspapers either. I think they don't see this as a hugely significant foreign international development, partly because their minds are very, very much on the talks going on around a peace settlement of the war between Ukraine and Russia. So I think there's that. But then if you go to other countries, I mean...
Hold on, before you leave, I mean,
Yes.
I'm also intrigued. So do you think, because Donald Trump is not here, do you think there's also that, clearly it's not that important, it's only if our president is there that it's worth even noting?
So I don't know enough about the way Americans perceive these things, but I don't think Americans are hugely engaged with multilateral organizations like this. I think, for example, the United Nations would perhaps get some more coverage, but I don't know if the US president was here, they'd have been here by the plane load, because wherever the US president goes, you've got to cover him in case he says something.
And where else?
So I look, for example, at the Times of India. Now, India is the world's fifth largest economy. People tend to think, BRICS, but actually India is a large, massive economy, a growing economy. They recently surpassed the UK in that fifth place. And they describe this as a landmark declaration unanimously agreed upon despite opposition and boycott by the United States. They highlighted the fact that the declaration included references to climate change, which, as we know, the US president has said is a hoax.
Yep.
And they described this as a subtle rebuke to President Trump. The other thing they noted, for example, is that their leader Narendra Modi commented that on the issues around global peace and conflicts, that he was very pleased that there was an unambiguous reference to rejecting all forms of terrorism, and Narendra Modi made the point that they're not distinguishing between good terrorism and bad terrorism. I don't think those phrases were ever used, but he had a particular political point that he wanted to make there.
And that's obviously relevant for him, what we've seen in the Kashmir region. They've been facing their own onslaught, haven't they?
Yes, and I think what that speaks to as well, Jane, is that people often say, well, why is the declaration not less ambiguous on this issue or that? And that's because when they sit down, there's arm wrestling.
Yeah.
So if you were to go to something that is relatively inconsequential in global trade, but I just thought I'd use it by way of illustration, they talk about the restitution of cultural property. In other words, things taken from countries that now are being held in other countries. Now, they are very vague about that. They say an open and inclusive dialogue on the return and restitution of cultural property. Now, you would have thought that's a no-brainer, but that's the UK probably saying, listen, if you want our support on this, we're not giving Greece the Elgin marbles back. Yeah. That's the way we roll on these things.
Exactly what I was going to say, yep.
But back to other kinds of coverage. If you look at ABC, the Australian broadcaster, huge presence in both television and radio. Again, they focus very much on climate change. It's a hot button issue in Australian politics. They refer to a subtle rebuke of Donald Trump, again with that reference. And then the Prime Minister of that country talks about this as a very positive move that the world wants to get on with cooperating. And I think it's a very interesting way that that's being reflected to an Australian audience, that yes, Donald Trump and the US became a story, but I can imagine it said in an Aussie accent. We want to get on with it, you know. And I think
Go on, do it.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's a strong sentiment coming through. Turning to the European media, and again, there isn't just one European media, and my language limitations would have framed that a little bit. Ukraine very much front and center, because a lot of countries come here, obviously for the business of the G20, but while they're here, they have all sorts of other meetings. On a less dramatic note, Norway and Canada announced they had a great meeting on cooperating about oil, but certainly Germany, Britain, and the French would have been very exercised around all the talks around Ukraine. And I would suspect that a lot of coverage in those titles, for example, if you look at The Guardian in the UK, all the foreign leads are about Ukraine. And when they reference G20, yes, they talk about what's discussed here, but I think front and center for them is, okay, if we have to rank the items, what was said and discussed about the Ukraine crisis and its possible resolution.
And I mean, I know that South Africa had to be a little muted when it came to some international issues in order to get their message across, to get the declaration signed. It doesn't mean that it can't be ramped up today. I mean, that business was finished early yesterday.
You know, I think there are two ways of looking at it, and I think both are correct. The point you made, exactly so. But I also think sometimes declarations represent a genuine balance of forces and a genuine balance of ideas. And I'll give you an example from the issues around debt relief. They talk about support vulnerable countries that have a strong reform agenda. And that would reflect a view, because coming from maybe the global south, an emphasis on the debt and the vulnerability, but coming perhaps from the wealthier countries in the world who may be funding or at least going back to their constituency, which includes big banks, and saying, hey, listen, they're saying, yes, okay, but not everybody gets it with no conditions at all.
Yeah.
And that's why I find the declaration quite fascinating. We could look at it and say, are they strong and unequivocal on this or that? Or are they saying, yeah, we're happy to do this provided you do that? And isn't that what the real world is?
Yeah.
You never get everything you want.
And how has this played out in the UK? I know that Keir Starmer got into quite a bit of trouble. They said it's yet another overseas trip. That's probably why he skedaddled yesterday.
Yes.
What's been said about it?
You know, I think every country has its politics. You don't get a sense that the Indian Prime Minister, for example, is under that kind of pressure. He can't be responsible for the bowlers in his cricket team who are getting whacked all over the place, to our absolute delight. But on a more serious note, British, I believe, have to pass a budget next week. Keir Starmer's numbers are not quite underwater, but they're not great. And it's an important point that you're making, that this is part of their business, but this is not their primary business. And I think it's true in our own country as well. I think by Monday, 8 o'clock, provided he doesn't need a few extra hours sleep, President Cyril Ramaphosa and everybody else ought to be getting back to the business of governing South Africa.
What have people said about Cyril Ramaphosa? Have you got the impression that he's come out well? Because that's what we are seeing, right? And it's also that he's developed a backbone in a time where those rumors are swirling about taking him out.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure to the extent to which it's personalized in the foreign media.
Yeah.
Although I did chat yesterday to Larry Madowo, who's a person obviously many will know as, you know, the face of important stories on Africa for CNN. And I did ask if there was any kind of appreciation for South Africa, and obviously represented by the president of the country, standing up to the US and saying, actually, you know what, we're going ahead, we're going to go ahead with our business and so on. As to whether the titles that I've looked at from other parts of the world reference him specifically as this being a reflection of a presidential style that they appreciate. I wouldn't say so. I think it's very much South Africa has delivered this. But I think, and I think this is a good thing, by the way. People are saying the G20 standing up, as I referenced the Australian Prime Minister saying, this is multilateralism standing up. And I think if you were to ask the South African President, does he want credit for this? I can't say what he might think in a private moment, but I think in general people would be saying, yeah, this is a win for a particular way of looking at the world. And the fact that they reference Ubuntu in the declaration right there in the first paragraph is something quite important. I am because you are, you know, and I think that struck a chord.
Now, I was talking a little bit earlier about the media area here, the fantastic coffee, which is not something that we're used to when we go to stories. We sit on, like, you know, crummy little benches and all of that kind of stuff. And that's not a superficial conversation, because actually what people see, it is one of their first impressions of a country that has got good hospitality, that is culturally warm.
So I think that's right, but also what my experience of this media center has been an incredibly high level of efficiency. Obviously, when you've got all these heads of state, not just the 19 countries, and not just the foreign ministers where they're here if they're not heads of state, but there's a lot of global leaders here, and they've had to create a really strong cordon around particularly their meeting area. But you know, we arrive, we park, okay, we got wet, but you know, nobody promised we would have no rain. But there are waiting shuttles, and the shuttles move quickly and they bring us here. And then the level of technical support, some might say coffee is a technical support. There are charging stations and there's Wi-Fi, there are rooms where TV stations conduct interviews, there are couch areas where people can do more informal kind of interviews. I don't know if I mentioned the charging stations, but I agree with you. I think it's very, very important that they take what we've done seriously, but also that we take very seriously our role in hosting something like this. Not paradoxically, but I think appropriately, we're just 400 meters away from the FNB Stadium where we hosted the World Cup, and people will say, well, should we spend all this money and so on? But my view is, if you're going to do it really, really, really well.
Of course. And
I think they have.
So, John, what do we do with this now as South Africans? I mean, we've had something that's successful, early signing of that declaration. We've stood up to the United States. We've raised the voice of the Global South. Where to from here? What do we do with this?
So I think one of the things you do about it is you recognize it for its potential, but you also recognize it for its limitations. So let's talk about the potential. There's a very interesting concept called the Overton window, and the Overton window is a sociological term that talks about, and I'll make sense of this now, but lest this sound terribly academic, but there are ideas and conversations that are way out there, and then you keep putting them on the agenda, and you get more and more significant people and groups of people to talk about them, and then suddenly they find themselves in the Overton window where people say, that's not a crazy idea. Now, I think this declaration is full of stuff that is not new, but some of it in the way it's being expressed, for example, ways of funding debt relief for African countries, suddenly that's not an out there idea, because a panel of people find that idea, they bring it to a forum like this, it gets spoken about by someone like with the statue of Trevor Manuel, and then suddenly that idea is in there. So people will say, well, are we going to see better debt relief for African countries next year? No, we're not. Are we going to see a more focused and precise and possibly effective conversation around that debt relief in the next 2-3 years? I think absolutely yes. So the possibilities for somebody listening saying, but who's going to fix the fact that I haven't had water for 22 days? This is not going to be that thing. That said, I don't think we must spend a lot of time either as a country or hopefully as government and people with agency in the country, including business, saying, well, boy, wasn't that brilliant? And, you know, you people shouldn't be moaning at us because the rest of the world thinks we're fabulous. We have homework, you know, and you may have got the prize for the best third-term results, but there's a matric exam to come, and we have many difficult matric papers to write, and we get on with it. The way we had to after the World Cup, by the way.
Yeah.
The world came here, they appreciated what we did, they left, and they left us with many of the problems we had before they came.
I'm going to let you go any minute now, but I mean, I suppose we've also, got to enjoy the fact that we've got these fantastic roads,
Yes.
and our leaders, in a way, have been exposed because this has shown that they can do it,
Absolutely.
and the money's there.
Absolutely, and you know, it's a point that our listeners have made a lot. You've been hosting shows over the last couple of weeks where you're getting those same kind of calls. It is ridiculous that you have to wait for something like this, for people to fix things that they have the money to fix, they have the equipment to fix, and if their political will is limited to doing it only when something like this happens, well, voters will know what they need to say about that. And in that sense, it's no different to our households. If you say, oh, well, you know, our relationship works because every time we have guests, all the things that my partner refuses to clean, they actually do. Those relationships tend not to last either. If they do, they tend to be very unhappy.
Indeed. John, thank you very much for that.
Thanks for having
And
me.
obviously we'll get more from you at 3 o'clock. John Perlman there talking to us about the image of South Africa after this. The world's media is here, the world's media are here, and interesting finding out the reflection and how little it's been covered in the United States. It is 12 o'clock now. Nokukanya Ntambo is on the other side of the room, and we're going to cross over to her now.
A massive thank you to Jane Dutton for really carrying through this morning with the coverage of the various things that are happening here at the Nasrec Expo Centre in the south of Joburg, where we continue our coverage of the G20 Summit. Of course, it is day 2. It's the last day. Everybody's just trying to push through it. Of course, we've spent the day really trying to unpack what it is that the discussions were yesterday, and you would have heard the various themes being touched on. The salient points really of that highly anticipated declaration that came out a little too early. In fact, in a G20 tradition and in the tradition of a lot of these blocs, generally today would have been the day that we have the declaration announced. So 24 hours later, and that's obviously meant a little bit of a shift in terms of the program here. I don't know if you remember seeing yesterday, but just exactly how President Cyril Ramaphosa navigated and switched up, even on the people that were in the room. I don't even think they anticipated exactly how that was going to go down in terms of the announcement of the declaration. Again, like I said, because it was anticipated that he would release it today, that sudden switch caught just about everybody, even those in the room, possibly even a little behind. But the program has, of course, shifted, and only this afternoon we expect, and I'm just throwing my eye onto the G20 stage right now, waiting to see if there's any developments in terms of possibly the heads of state, or some of them at least, who are able to come through to the media center where we are to perhaps give us their perspective in terms of what has happened and just their thoughts, I suppose, on what now post the G20 summit. We were told earlier that there is a possibility that the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi would come through. Of course, South Africa enjoys strong bilateral ties with India, and it would have been really nice to get his perspective on how, and he's actually in fact even part of BRICS. So it would have been really nice to get his perspective on how, you know, that blend, I suppose, or even the interaction and the intersection of those various blocs, whether we're talking about G20 or we're talking about BRICS, would have been really interesting. I don't know if he will still come through. Of course, again, like I said, because it's the last day of the summit today, the program is a little fluid. A lot of the delegates will start either flying out today or even tomorrow. tomorrow. There's also a possibility of having President Ndrogen coming through to also speak to us. Like I said, if you see my eyes wander a little off the camera, just know that I'm just trying to keep watch of what else is happening around us, and we'll hopefully be able to catch up with anybody who does wander into the media center during the course of the time that I am with you. My name is Nogukanya Mdambo. Welcome to EWN TV. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start first with the conversation that we had a little earlier with Minister in the Presidency, Kumbutso Chabeni, who had a little to say about how yesterday unfolded, what it means for the bilateral ties of South Africa, her response to some of the comments that had been made even earlier in the week by US delegates. Have a listen to this, where we caught up with, again, Minister in the Presidency, Kumbutso Chabeni.
Forward with the tensions, the diplomatic tensions with the US, what's the next step as far as discussions are concerned? And as
Which
far
discussions?
With the United States.
Which discussions?
The declaration specifically, as well as can you respond to the revoking of the visa of former Minister Naledi Pandor? Are you not concerned that this might happen to other members of government?
Okay, let's start here. There are no tensions between us and the US. The declaration that has been adopted is the declaration of the G20 leaders. It's not a declaration of one country over the other. It's a declaration of the G20 leaders. It has been accepted, and we are going to implement the declaration of the G20. And what we have done, like we've said during the social summit, we have prioritized those things in the declaration that South Africa, the African countries, and our partners in the G20 will be able to continue to implement. We don't need anybody to take them forward. We can take them forward ourselves. But also the United Kingdom will take over after. We'll remain part of the Troika of the G20, and we'll make sure that the South African voice will be there. If they don't want us to participate, they'll have to tell the 19 other members of the G20 that South Africa cannot participate, and the world will have to watch what the other members of the G20 will do. But we are part of the Troika as the outgoing president. The US will be the president. The UK will be the incoming president. So we are rock and roll in terms of implementation. We focus on what the implementation, what we have resolved to do and to implement. The other issues you are referring to is matters that DECO will then have to deal with. Former Minister Naledi Pandor is not a minister of cabinet. If they revoke whoever, like any other country, when they decide you come in, give you a visa, do not give you a visa, it doesn't change the price of bread. Even if they revoke my visa, it's fine. I will not have to go to the US. Actually, majority of us don't go to the US. We go for the UN meetings.
Just a quick comment on the kind of language being used by the Trump administration, saying the president is running his mouth, that kind of talk. Any response to that kind of posture? We are bigger than that.
We are bigger than that. And President Ramaphosa has demonstrated to the world that he's a leader amongst leaders. He's gotten this G20 summit to be successful. Brazil had to concede that they innovated the social summit, but we did one better to them. And there's consensus in all the things that are being tabled. We've pushed the African agenda to the top. If it was not because of the sterling leadership of President Ramaphosa, we will not be here. And the other commentary, why should we elevate nothing?
That was, of course, Minister in the Presidency, Kumbutso Chabeni, addressing perhaps maybe some of the things outside of the G20, the issues, the geopolitical issues, the bilateral ties between South Africa and the US. Of course, it remains an important conversation. Again, I've been saying this for the past couple of weeks now. They are a strategic partner to South Africa. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And so addressing some of those comments, I don't know if you remember the US Press Secretary Catherine Levitt just talking about, quote unquote, the President of South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa, running his mouth. That's what she would have addressed in some of those comments. But we switch back now to Nasrec here in the south of Joburg, just discussing post the G20 summit. Of course, it's not just about the big summit itself. It's important to find out exactly what happens post the G20, what sort of initiatives exist to make sure that we're able to carry through some of the commitments from the G20 presidency, and of course make sure that they have a long-lasting impact on South Africans as well. And joining me now for that is Selo Hadang, who stands next to me. He is the executive for strategic relations at the G20 Legacy Project. Selo, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us on EWN TV this this afternoon. Start us off first with what the G20 Legacy Project is and what the purpose of it is.
Thank you very much. It's actually a project that's called the G20 Knowledge Initiative, because the initiative itself is ensuring that we preserve the knowledge coming out of this. That's why we've been jealous about ensuring that we create an archive. You kind of create a heritage. This is not just a day, a weekend event, but actually it's a moment in history. How do we capture this and capture it well? How do we ensure that those who are still to be born find something out of it? So we have a hub that we're building at the moment, and that hub would have the archive of everything that has transpired. Part of that is also working with universities who would be helping us with monitoring. You check how much progress have we made of the things that the undertakings that have been made. And also to be practical, also to say to South Africans, how do you actually make sure that you understand it for what it is to you? So part of the project is it would be to have an exhibition, both digital and also that it would be a traveling exhibition that would be able to take to your home and say, this is what G20 means to you. I was telling someone earlier on that when you talk about issues of climate change and green energy and people, fossil energy, all that, they're thinking, but what are we talking about? Fossil fuels, and reduce it to where people are. And you say to people, when a merchant who is selling coal, you know that that's what we would cook with. What does it mean when you're now saying you can't use that? And that's what we then need to then see. How do we make sure that that's something that happens and it's promoted to a common understanding of what the work should be.
I imagine that would have started even before today. So during the course of the South African presidency of the G20, that sort of knowledge sharing would have had to take place from the very beginning. What does that look like? Does that look like, the G20 Legacy Project going out into the communities and having engagements with them? Or is that only through the hub that and you'll tell me where the hub lives exactly, but how do people engage with that particular hub?
So the project started in around Feb. And it's been a long process of putting building blocks in place. So there's a storytelling part, which is what we're doing here, where we're getting senior people to come and speak to us about the experiences of the G20. What do they expect to have to come out of this end? But also experiences of people like you, journalists. What has been your take of this? So we're going to produce it's just a documentary of that. But that's a documentary that would then be flighted everywhere, that would put on our platforms, but it would be shared widely. When we talk about the exhibition, that's part of the storytelling, where you then exhibit the work that has been produced over the time, policies that have come through, make them make sense to the common person, that they can understand what these policies mean, but also that what do the commitments mean to a regular Joe, as the saying goes. So how do we make sure that these things are understandable? So the hub itself, it's in a form of a website that you'd be able to go into the website, the G20 Knowledge Initiative, and then you'd get access to that information. But then in there, you'd of course have many layers of the information that you need to then access to that. One of the big things, of course, is that you have knowledge being able to make knowledge freely available. So we need to be talking to networks, our networks, to say, how do we make sure that we can access, make sure that the hub is zero rated. A person who's in the rural area, they don't have to have data to access this info. Those are negotiations that we'll do. We need to commend DERCO for these initiatives, for example, because it's important that our government is thinking long term. It's not just a weekend thing, as I said. It needs to be a lived reality for many more.
Just speaking about people in the rural areas and the question about accessibility, what happens in terms of the language barrier? Because a lot of what we have seen throughout the course of the G20 presidency, and just generally, with not just with the South African presidency, but overall as G20 since its existence, really is how complex the conversations here tend to be. And you mentioned, obviously, part of this is trying to bring them down to, the level of a common man, myself, you, and understanding what it really means outside of the conversations with the bloc. How do you make that accessible in terms of the language as well? Because in the conversations that I have, it's highbrow conversations. People will always say it's highbrow, even the terminology itself, highbrow. How do you bring that, and as well as the language? We have 11 official languages in the country. Is that an aspect of it as well in terms of accessibility?
One of the things that we pride ourselves with is that we're partnering with universities. So we already have UNISA, we have University of Pretoria, we have UCT, you have UJ. We're hoping that all universities will join this initiative over time. Once you get that, it means that they would be able to reduce some of these things to understandable language. But we are very ambitious as well, that down the line we are hoping that this information will cascade down to the school level, that we partner with the basic education, Department of Basic Education. So not just higher education, but basic education as well. That children must understand what this means. When a child is doing an interview, they've got a homework, they should be able to just quickly go in there and get information that makes sense as a child, for a child. So that's the ambitious part of it. But that, for us to achieve that, it will take a lot of work that would go there. Are we ready for it? We are. And it's something that would continue to just say, through collaboration with the government, with the civil society, but also with the corporate sector, that corporate must come on board and fund these projects so that the project can then make sense for the greater good of people. And I like how you're saying, most of these things are up there, but actually we need to then be saying, how do we make sure that it's accessible, more accessible? That's the work that we'll be doing.
Just in closing and very briefly, Sello, what are the sort of conversations in terms of, when you're speaking of the ordinary man, what are they telling you? I know you've worked with a couple of foundations even in the past, so you know how to go back to the grassroots. What have they told you of their perception of blocks like the G20 and these sort of global engagements that we find ourselves in? How effective do they reckon they have been, even in the past, not just with this one, because again, we've had the conversation about how the policies that are being spoken about here aren't implementable today. They're all for the long run, right? And so we can speak about the forums that we've had in the past. How effective have those been?
I think these forums have been very critical for people to understand, and that's why it's been important for what South Africa did, where it was going through sector by sector, not just doing work at a particular level and only at that level. And I think if we are to do this right, part of the work that we'll be doing is to convene dialogues. So we'll have dialogues as part of the exhibiting of the work. We'll have these dialogues. But I think most importantly, your question goes back to, does it make sense for someone who doesn't actually even understand what does the G20 mean? And I think that's the test, that we need to always go back there. What does it mean? How do we make sure that it makes sense to the common person? But the most important thing that I was saying earlier on, that if G20 has to deliver anything, is hope. Hope that this country carries a lot of dreams, that it can deliver those dreams and make them possible. But that if we are able to do that from down south, that it gets infused up the continent, that the continent takes on that hope. The dreams of the child who's born in Kuma, in the northwest, don't just have to die, because these processes are saying to us, we are still part of the global community, we are still part of making a difference, but let's make that difference also where it matters most, in our people.
Sello, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. That's Sello Hadang, who is the executive for Strategic Relations, speaking to us about how some of these highbrow conversations that are being had here at the G20 can be brought down to a level of understandability, knowledge sharing, being able to understand what it means not just for today, but how we then take some of these projects forward, and what long-lasting impact and effect they have on South Africans. So the question really I have to you, you're more than welcome to share it in the comment section right now, is there an impact on your life? Do you imagine, does it inspire hope, like Silo Hatang just mentioned now? Do you sit here and think, shoo, somewhere down the line, we certainly will have something to share with generations and something tangible more than anything to share with the generations. As we continue with this conversation here at the Nasrec Expo Center about the impact on communities, yesterday you would have seen in EWN and our coverage, Alpha Ramushwana, who's a colleague of mine, was covering a protest just down the road in the, what did they call it? I think it was the Speaker's Corner. It was an area that was allocated to South Africans who had just about anything that they wanted to voice were more than welcome to come through to this area, wanted to share. That area was designated for them. Of course, it is a high security zone just around here, so it was an area far down the road. Far down the road, left to them to share their comments there. What happened there is we had Operation Dudula coming through, of course, as they had said during the course of the week that they really wanted to voice their opinions, not just about the forum itself, but really about some of the domestic issues that they reckon need to be tackled prior to South Africa going onto the global stage to address the geopolitical issues, the socio-economic crises on a global scale. And that's exactly what we saw yesterday. So we're just going to get a quick update from Athlenda Mate, who's the National Police spokesperson, just about what happened there and where to from now in terms of, I think there was arrest of 2 people and where that was really taken post that. Athlenda, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us on EWN TV. Like I mentioned, we had the Speaker's Corner yesterday. It turned a little ugly for a short while with Operation Dudula voicing some of their opinions. I know it may not be your terrain, but what exactly was it that they were here to say from what you gathered?
Well, let's firstly thank those interest groups that actually came out and were allocated to the identified speakers' corners for actually protesting and airing their grievances within the confines of the law. Our only challenge and the only grouping we had a problem with was Dudula, wherein they were forcefully trying to march towards the venue. They also attempted to blockade Baragwanath and Nasrec Road, which we all know it's a key route that is used by foreign heads of state or key dignitaries that are attending this particular summit. So our members were on the ground. They gave them several warnings. They resisted. They were being difficult, and we then had to enforce the law accordingly. So ultimately, 2 Dudula members were arrested, a 48 and a 54-year-old man. They were charged with public violence, the assaulting of a police officer, because during that scuffle in trying to actually get them to get back to the Speaker's Corner, one police officer was actually injured. He had to be taken to a local hospital for further medical care and so on. The third charge was contravention of the court order, because if you're trying to block a piece of road that is being utilized by foreign heads of states, then you're contravening the very court order that said stop harassing foreign nationals, stop intimidating them, and so on. So those are the 3 charges that they are facing as a group, and as the 2 suspects that we have arrested. But so far everything is running smooth. There have not been any disruptions to the actual event. You would have seen security has been heightened, and that is just to ensure that this event takes place in a safe, secure, and a peaceful environment.
Operation Dudula had vowed to return today. Am I correct that they didn't in fact return then?
Well, the day is still long. It's only 12 o'clock once. So we do not have a problem with people coming to, protest and so on, but do so within the confines of the law. Don't disrupt any proceedings. Don't be unruly. Your protest shouldn't have criminal elements, I mean, it's everyone's constitutional right to protest and, to voice out their concerns and so on. So we are in support of anyone who wants to come here, and go to the speakers' corners and air their grievances. But what we won't allow is any form of criminality, any form of lawlessness. We are going to act decisively, and I think we actually were stamping the authority of the state yesterday when we showed the full might of the law by, quickly arresting those that were found on the wrong side of the law.
Just lastly, going forward again, post G20, in terms of policing, South Africans are obviously chuffed that there's better police visibility in the build-up to the G20 Leaders Summit, because like you said, there's heightened police visibility. Can we expect the same sort of responses going forward in terms of policing, especially in areas outside of the G20 routes where you often hear the criticism that there's not enough police there, police aren't able to respond to the challenges that South Africans have? Is this sustainable for you in terms of addressing the long-standing issues that South Africans have?
Look, we've got Operation Chanela that is running every week. We just, in the last 7 days, we arrested 17,000 suspects for various crimes. Ranging from murder to rape, attempted murder, and so on. We seized about 121 unlicensed firearms. Actually, every week we don't seize less than 140 unlicensed firearms. So it tells you the work is continuing, it's continuous, it's ongoing. We've had major takedowns. I think just yesterday there was millions worth of drugs that were found in a warehouse in Johannesburg and so on. Previous weeks we've had drug mules that were arrested at Oratambo. We had the 20 million rand drug bust in Midrand. There were, kidnappers that were tracked down and fatally wounded. So the work does continue. It's not only for G20, but we as South Africans need to understand that we must rally behind G20 because we are looking at obviously economic spin-offs. So we need these leaders to meet so that, obviously we improve certain, aspects in terms of the challenges that we're facing as a country. So and that is why it's important that when they do come, this event takes place in a very secure environment and so on. So we are here to ensure that up until tomorrow, everything goes smoothly, everything goes according to plan, that our international visitors as well as South Africans are and feel safe. And I think it's important that none of the police officers that were here were actually taken from the stations. There's still the police officers at the stations that will assist ordinary community members with their complaints. We still have the police vans at the stations that are responding to calls and so on. You would have heard that we also responded to, the attempted hijacking of the NIU members, actually, where a person tried to hijack NIU members, and unbeknown to him, he didn't know that the people he's trying to hijack, they're actually police officers. And, they responded swiftly, and he was shot and wounded, and he's under police guard in hospital.
Right, and just lastly, obviously it's business as usual for South Africans as they return to work tomorrow. Any expectations for disruptions as the heads of state start to leave South Africa? Can you just give us a sense of just early morning disruptions that can be expected? Are we still in a red zone? So that's that sort of information, please.
Yeah, so Nasrec is still in a red zone up until tomorrow. So uncompromising security measures, and there's still those road closures that the residents in and around here will experience. Tomorrow, most of the heads of state, as of tonight, actually starting with tonight up until tomorrow morning, they'll start making their way to the airports to leave the country and so on. And I think so far South Africans have been cooperating with the complete road closures and so on. So let's be patient up until tomorrow. After tomorrow, life is back to normal, and we'd like to actually appreciate the majority, actually all South Africans that have really welcomed our visitors in the true spirit of Ubuntu, because there's not been any major incidents around this particular event and in and around Johannesburg. So we really like to thank you for being patriotic and for supporting a good cause.
All right, Athlenda, thank you so much for your time. That's Athlenda Mate, who is the National Police spokesperson, speaking to us about the policing issues. Again, I keep saying this, it should probably be my tagline at this point, not just at G20, but post the G20. Of course, they have security measures in place to deal with the security protocols that are required for an event of this magnitude, where you have 42 countries in South Africa at the moment, of course, and that includes includes heads of state. Tomorrow there will still be slight disruptions, so please look out for those. We surely will have those on some of our EWN platforms, whether it's EWN Updates or EWN Reporter, to bring you the updates of what you need to know as you navigate. But again, it's policing post the G20 presidency. Are you convinced about South Africa's capability outside of this? They clearly have the man force. If there's one thing that I certainly realized throughout the course of this week particularly, is that we do have the manpower, we do have the resources. It will always be a question of where those resources are and where and how they go. Please do let me know if you have any confidence at all that there'll be an improvement in policing post this. Of course, we've been told by local government, provincial government, that a lot of the work that was put into the G20 in preparation is now going to be used as a blueprint post the G20, and that includes service delivery, and that of course includes policing as well. So please do let me know if you are optimistic at all in our capabilities. I mentioned earlier that we also have, or at least one of the stories that my colleague Alpha Ramushwana was covering earlier with Operation Dudula. That's the update that we were getting from Athlenda Mate, who's the National Police spokesperson. But I thought I'd rope him in just for a little while. Some of you don't know his face. You hear Alpha Ramushwana, Eyewitness News. I'm going to bring you the face now, and maybe just touch base with Alpha in terms of not just his experience here and inside and outside of the Nasrec Expo Center, those conversations. Alpha, very good afternoon to you, Alpha Ramushwana. Yeah, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Start me off first with what we saw outside. Maybe not so much on Operation Dudula, because Athlenda has gone into length with the Speaker's Corner and what we saw there. But were there other organizations that were there who had grievances to air? If they were, what were they telling you? Even if it wasn't just yesterday at the Speaker's Corner, in the build-up, you're often on the ground, in the build-up to G20 and this Leaders Summit, what have you been hearing about concerns from the ground and from the residents of not just Joburg, but also Gauteng overall?
We had the Umkhonto weSizwe Party, which was also protesting alongside Operation Dudula yesterday, but a really, really small group of MK Party members or supporters came out from Soweto, and their concerns about poor service delivery. They're citing unemployment, that it doesn't, similar to Operation Dudula, claiming that it doesn't make sense for South Africa to be focusing on an international gathering, to be hosting heads of state from various countries where people are suffering. People don't have employment in South Africa. In Soweto, in Johannesburg, they are struggling with water and electricity. So those members of Operation Dudula that were here really wanted to speak to some of the officials in the city of Johannesburg, in Gauteng. Even the president tried to get the president to raise those demands, that they want water, they want electricity, they want cheaper electricity, which is something that they've been protesting for quite some time. We also had a number of judges, or former judges, retired judges, who were protesting yesterday, claiming that they are having some issues with their pension funds. But for some reason they could not speak to us, and they were quick to leave. I think they were there for about 10-15 minutes and they left. And those are some of the demonstrators and the protesters that we saw at the Speaker's Corner yesterday, demonstrating against the G20 summit.
Very briefly, Alpha, is that the same sort of sentiment that you see when you are out at stories covering human interest issues? Are these grievances that Operation Dudula airing reflective of the broader society in your opinion?
Certainly, most people in my time on the ground have mentioned the very same socio-economic issues, unemployment. I mean, you go to Soweto, you speak to supporters of any political parties, the first thing that they mention is that my daughter is unemployed. We're surviving off of a 2,000 Rand grant. Which is what they were protesting for, these organizations, that let's fix the unemployment crisis before we can even think about tackling issues on the global stage or geopolitical matters. So it certainly is the sentiment on the ground that the country isn't focusing on the domestic challenges.
Alpha, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. That's Alpha Ramushwana, who is our EWN reporter, always bringing you the very latest on all of our various platforms, EWN Reporter, EWN Updates, as well as our ewn.co.za website and Prime Media Plus. Shoo. All of that very latest always on our platform, telling us that really some of the issues that were being brought in yesterday are reflective of some of the broader issues that the public often raises. I'm going to shift now a little again to Tourism Minister Patricia de Lille, who joins us now to perhaps give us an update in terms of what sort of outcomes came from a policy perspective when it comes to tourism in the country, what she hopes the G20 will achieve in terms of bringing more people into the country and of course more revenue for South Africa, but more importantly how much they actually made from it. That's the one that I'm more interested in. Patricia de Lille, Minister Patricia de Lille, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Of course there's more to your portfolio than just the visits themselves. I'll start with the policy perspectives. Post the COVID-19 pandemic, the world shifted a little in terms of tourism and how people traveled around the world and where they weren't. Speak to me first about that transition post-COVID and where we are now. I think it was last year we had recovered and rebounded from that COVID period. Where are we now?
Well, first of all, tourism is part of the declaration of the G20 adopted yesterday. And as the G20 tourism ministers, we had taken it a step further after the declaration and we had agreed on an action plan. And so where are we now? Tourism is no longer recovering, we are growing. Our domestic sector is the bedrock of our tourism. Once we were locked in and locked down and we were not able to fly out of the country, South Africans started traveling in their own country. And therefore the domestic tourism is actually contributing more than our international tourists. But also good news on the international arrivals. For the first time in the history of tourism, the United States of America have overtaken the number of arrivals compared to the United Kingdom. And 2 direct flights from the US, and the visitors are just coming in. So where are we now? We are growing. We've received more than 1.1 million visitors in the first 9 months of the year compared to 2024. Our challenge now is to ride on this wave of these achievements and continue to build and continue to collaborate and to partner with the private sector. Continue to build our marketing. So there are lots of work for all of us to be done.
Auntie Pat, just speak to me about how post the COVID pandemic again you've had to rethink how we do tourism. What's that look like? How, even though we have come out and we've recovered, but how have you had to rethink? So you're bringing in, again, the domestic tourists. How do you attract them to the sites they see every single day?
Well, what we do is that, especially for domestic tourism, is accessibility and affordability. We know the cost of living is very high in South Africa. So we partnered with the private sector to make it more affordable for domestic tourism. And through the Short Left campaign, offer discounts up to 50%. So we continue to work together on the affordability. The second one is that we lost many jobs during the COVID-19 period because we were the worst hit sector. It's all slowly coming back. Tourism offers a great opportunity to employ especially young people that's semi-skilled and unskilled. So we've got a joint program with the private sector for demand-led skills and also government investing and paying using our EPWP programs, the public programs, to fund young people to learn and earn in the hospitality sector.
Very briefly, let's crunch some numbers. During this period of the G20 presidency, whether from the very beginning in November last year and even more recently, what numbers did we see coming in? What revenue are we expecting to have made from the G20 presidency overall across the country?
We are busy with the audits because you want to get an accurate reflection now, because on the G20 website, from January, we have shown the visitors and the delegates what else they can do while they are in our country. We have sold packages. So some people are staying now after the G20. Some of them have come earlier. And I think there's an estimated figure just for Gauteng, because they are hosting the bigger part, and that's over 1 billion already. But in the next week or so, we'll be able to crunch the numbers and release the real impact of the G20 presidency over the whole year and how we have benefited.
I said that was the last one, but you made a very interesting point in your opening now. You said the number of US visitors coming into South Africa has increased. And that's especially interesting considering the sort of narrative that's been put to Americans by their president, Donald Trump. Why are we seeing this increase? Is it because, do you reckon, Americans are not believing the mistruths, of course, about South Africa and what's happening in South Africa? Or what is it that you're seeing is driving this push?
Despite all of the lies and the misinformation about our country, we have seen the number of American visitors increasing. I suppose people want to come and see for themselves, is it true? But also tourism is not affected by the tariff debate and the geopolitics tension. And the American visitors are getting value for money when they come here. So I think that we must continue as South Africans, stop scoring our own goals. Because there are also some South Africans that are bad-mouthing our country all over the world. But we need to continue to be positive, because the truth will always survive.
Patricia de Lille, a big thank you to you. That's Minister of Tourism, Patricia de Lille, just speaking to us about what we expect to have made in terms of the G20 presidency. That's often a very big one. Revenue from tourism is a big one. Earlier in the week, I think I'd asked Gauteng Premier Panyaza Lesufi sort of the same question, but in particularly where it relates to the Gauteng province in terms of what they anticipate to have generated throughout the year. They are still crunching the numbers, as Patricia de Lille mentioned now, but of course that increase in hotel bookings, the different destinations, visiting our tourist hotspots, that's a really big one. But what I know has also been addressed during the course of the year when it comes to tourism, or the issues when it comes to crime in certain areas. Of course, that's a big one. If our visitors are unable to have certainty in terms of their safety coming into South Africa, that really does often cause a dent in tourism overall. And so often we've been told that they are trying to make sure that certain hotspots, think of Table Mountain, the hiking trail around there has often been a really big one in terms of crime for tourists. You've heard the horror stories. Sometimes they don't make it into the news, but trust, there are a lot of those. So trying to address those issues is a really big one, even within the G20 presidency, because again, crime is not an exception to South Africa. So those are the sort of conversations that Patricia de Lille and her counterparts would have, of course, had to have. We'll continue, of course, with our coverage here at the Nasrec Expo Center. Allow me to just throw my eye around the room again to see if there are shifts. I'm looking now. The minute you see somebody moving around or a group of people moving around in the media center, please know that they're all rushing to someone, and you'll be caught off guard because they all gather around in a huge scrum. You won't even be able to see who it is. So again, when I do wander around in terms of my eyes, it's because I'm just trying to figure out who is coming up. Like I mentioned, we are still having a number of meetings behind closed doors, particularly the bilateral meetings between the different countries inside. Those are, of course, not open to us. It's really often just a commitment between countries in terms of strengthening the ties, the existing ties that they have, and the possibility even of investment opportunities, because those are the sort of conversations that they often have. And so that sort of lull during the course of the day comes from that. I am now going to just ask our political analyst Sanusha Naidu to join me for maybe just some perspective in terms of what's happening throughout the afternoon, what bilateral conversations we need to be looking out for, what the expectations are, and what possible outcomes could come from that. Sanusha, you and I haven't caught up today. A very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I mentioned that the rest of the afternoon will probably be dedicated to bilateral ties. Speak to me about who we know are meeting behind closed doors and why those meetings are important right now.
I think what happens now is that a lot of these summits actually are ventilated by bilateral and trilateral engagements. I want to mention two that I think are very significant, not to say that the others are not. One is the fact that the India, Brazil, South Africa trilateral met this morning, and there's a communique, or there's a statement that has been issued by the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, and that is very significant at a time when, as the statement highlights, the international architecture is in a state of an inflection point. And that what you're really talking about is the idea that you need to start thinking about how countries start to deepen cooperation, but also make cooperation much more implementable. And I think these are key issues. So some of the things that came out of this trilateral, and also this is an interesting thing, this trilateral is considered to be the meeting of three countries that actually use their democratic pivot as a key factor and a key characterization of what global governance reform should be. So things like on the UN security reform agenda, and also in terms of issues with regard to the development fund that helps to pilot projects around socioeconomic and other forms of development, and just thinking about the declaration and how it speaks about Agenda 2030 and of course the SDGs. I mean, this fund has been in existence for a while. But I think it's also very important to note that the India Brazil South Africa summit, the IPSA summit, hasn't really found its traction in a couple of years. So now this was an ideal opportunity to do so. Also, these three countries have been basically bearing the brunt of the Trump presidency. Three democracies that kind of got into a bit of a tussle with Trump, and of course, India also, in a sense, has not been able to navigate the relationship with the Trump presidency as it did previously with other administrations in the U.S. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic now to see them come together. The other one was the trilateral that happened between Canada, India, and Australia, and it looks at innovation and technology, etc. Again, I think these are ideal moments that countries have in order to build, to spearhead, and to embed these engagements around trilateralism. And I think what's really interesting right now is that at this G20 summit, we're seeing those innovations of engagement and cooperation happening. We're seeing countries coming together. One of the things that I picked up from the India, South Africa, Brazil meeting this morning was deepening digital public infrastructure, which was a big issue that India had when it had the presidency of the G20, and that is a continuation. And it's very interesting to see it's being ventilated under the IPSA banner. Similarly, the technological innovation between Canada, Australia, and India, again, three Commonwealth countries, in a sense, and talking about that innovation and how to help and how to be engaging. So I think, these summits are not just about what happens in the room. It is what happens behind closed doors that helps countries to then find their trade, their investment, and deepen their cooperation.
You mentioned first the trilateral with Brazil and India, as well as South Africa, of course. That communique, you're my eyes and ears on that one. What were some of the outcomes in that particular communique? If you're able to just maybe give us your top one or two of those outcomes that stand out most to you.
Well, I think it's very important that this communique is recognizing that global governance has not gone where it should be gone. So UN security reform, that's a big thing for India, Brazil, South Africa, because these countries want to be part of that in a reformed UN Security Council. There's tensions around that. It's not going to happen. Is it with veto? Is it without veto? So I think putting that back onto the agenda, making sure that the UN has to now be ventilated in terms of what the reform agenda is, and particularly the power dynamic of the UN Security Council. The other one was around the issue of DPI, digital public infrastructure, which India spearheaded under its G20 presidency in 2023. And so in many ways, that now is seeing how India is using those, countries can use the agenda of the G20 and also try and spearhead it at the trilateral level. And then the continued support for the UN, for the India, Brazil, South Africa Development Fund.
A lot of the conversations here have also centered around reforms to certain international institutions. You mentioned now the UN Security Council. The Security Council is really top of a lot of people's minds because it sways a lot of issues, especially when we're dealing with issues of conflict and wars across the globe. Are these institutions capable of reform? We speak about the World Trade Organization as well. We speak about IMF as well as part of that cluster of organizations that are being called to change and to adapt to the contemporary issues that we face now. Do you have confidence that they have the ability to reform?
It's a long road of reform, and I think sometimes we tend to we tend to use the word reform meaning transform, and I think that's a bigger challenge. This is a set of institutions at the global level that represent a world of 1945 and thereafter. In the last 80 years, and remember the UN celebrated 80 years of its existence this year. In the last 80 years, we've seen major shifts in the global architecture. And those shifts meant that the power balance has also shifted. There are new centers of financial power. There are new centers of cultural power. There are new centers of actors in terms of looking at where different actors are coming from. And there are more actors coming into Africa. So I think the problem we need to think about is the reform is a contested reform. And so it will be a long drawn-out process because countries don't want to give up that power. And more importantly, they don't want to give up what that power means for them. So I think, listening to the Norwegian ambassador now and talking to what the Norwegians did as guests to the G20 is they wanted stronger language on reform. They wanted stronger language on peace and security. But I think the stronger language means that you're going to have to deal with the contestation of what reform means. So we have to deal with it. It's going to be for the next couple of years, even in the next couple of, in the next 10, 15 years, if not longer, we've got to deal with that contestation. And perhaps the best way to describe it is what an Italian Marxist philosopher quoted. He said, "The old is dying, the new is yet to be born, but in the interim, you have the consequences of morbidity." This is where we are right now.
Very interesting. Speaking still about the bilateral and trilateral ties, just coming back here, but maybe on a broader scope. The trilateral that you mentioned first are also members of BRICS, for example, and often there's an intersectionality of some of these blocs. At the end of the day, we just want to know whether or not these achieve the mandates that they have, where you have often, for example, BRICS and the G20. Sometimes they have competing mandates, but you'll find often that there are countries on BRICS, but also on G20. Firstly, do you reckon that these blocs, whether economic, political, are still relevant and are able to meet the demands of the current time, and perhaps even how they possibly even navigate some of those issues?
Well, on the first question, I think you've got to remember all of these different platforms have sub-regional blocks. They do have competing blocks, and they will always have that. So if you look at how the G7 came about, it was the G5 and then it became the G7. Within the G7, you have countries that belong to who are in the European Union, and of course with Brexit, the UK is out. You have countries that are part of a Quad, for example, which is the Quad, which is security alliance in Australia, in the the Asian context, which is Australia, the UK, the US, and Japan. India and Japan. So these are some of the dynamics that you will find. It's normal, it's natural, it's how it works. In the BRICS, you just don't have IPSA. You also have a dimension of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is made up of Russia, India, and China. And you have GCC things as well. So I think in terms of whether they're going to achieve their mandate, it's going to be long drawn out because they are competing interests. And more importantly, and I know that there's a press conference happening right now, and quite frankly, I think that how they manage these processes, because what we saw with India, we saw that India, having been dealt with the Trump presidency in the way that it has, what we saw with India is that India now has turned back to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We're seeing a little bit of that, and it's turning back to a reinvigoration of IPSA. So I think to a large extent, the mandates that you find at the level of the G20 or at the level of the G7 or at the level of, say, NATO, etc., and other kinds of regional blocks or global multilateral fora, it all depends how they work at that sub-regional level.
Speaking still of those regional blocs, the AU made a debut on the G20 forum very recently. Of course, The African Union has often been criticized in terms of whether or not it's a toothless body or whether it's able to address the various crises on the African continent. In its first G20 summit, your assessment of the AU and what you hope, at least, like the President of South Africa and the rest of the South African delegation have been saying that they hope that it will be able to push forward and put the African agenda on the table. Your assessment of it first.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that the AU has become a priority. It's important to recognize that the AU's framework is there in terms of the debt issue, in terms of development, in terms of Agenda 2063. And I think it's something that will have to continue. What we have to also note that in the presidency of the US, we're not going to see the same level of adherence or traction for the AU, but we have to deal with that. So it's a work in progress, and I think at the end of the day, we have to recognize that the AU being now front and center in terms of how you interpret this declaration, it means that the AU also has to now start gearing up and using this opportunity to create that synergy around how it wants to take its agenda, its interests, its development forward within the G20.
Just as you and I wrap, we've obviously turned our screen now to the media center, where you're seeing the front of the stage, where we expect the media briefing to take place any time. You'll see that's where we have been addressed over the past couple of days, even in the build-up to the G20, where we had various delegates coming in to speak to us about the preparations, the expectations, and even some of the outcomes yesterday when we had International Relations Minister Ronald Lamola, as well as the G20 Sherpa Zane Dango and the Sue Sherpa Kolisi Mabongo speaking to us about the very latest. So what we've pivoted to now is the South African flag next to the Turkey flag, just signaling that we are expecting, as far as I understand, the Turkish presidency to come through and speak to us. Sanusha, as you and I wrap our relationship with Turkey, speak to me about that and why this is relevant, and if any expectations at all in terms of what the President would want to say to the South African delegates in terms of the G20 outcomes.
Well, I think Turkey is becoming quite an important actor in South Africa, especially from the cultural perspective, in terms of the kinds of cultural infrastructure we see that Turkey has in South Africa. I mean, if you're driving to Nasrec or you're driving around, you see this beautiful Turkey-built mosque, and it has an incredible architecture, an incredible set of cultural remnants to it. You're getting a lot of visitors coming from Turkey into South Africa. You got Turkish airlines that are flying into various of our main centers. And of course, you know, you can't shy away from the fact that people are watching more and more Turkish soap operas, which are now being screened on our screens. But I think from a more kind of diplomatic perspective, and also from the level of the African continent, Turkey is an actor. Turkey is also playing an active role in peace and security issues up in the Horn of Africa, in terms of what's going on with regard to Sudan, etc. And these are opportunities South Africa can take in order to start engaging with Turkey as an actor in terms of what traction it has in the continent. So it is an actor that will bring investment, trade, etc. And I suspect that that will be part of the President's briefing of how this G20 aligns with Turkey's national interest, but also how it aligns to the broader continental questions of their role in trade investment, and of course their role as actors in the peace and security architecture.
Like I mentioned, we are expecting a briefing in terms of the ties, the bilateral ties between South Africa and Turkey. Like you saw just a few moments ago, that South African flag flying next to the Turkey flag, signaling any moment now that we are going to have a briefing. It will be very interesting to get a sense from them, of course, in terms of what came out of some of the conversations that they've had. Again, if there are any commitments in terms of investment, the continued investment, and how else to strengthen even the political ties between the two countries. And of course, that's set to get underway at about 1 o'clock, just a few minutes time. So if you will please allow Sanusha and I to step away and go and get ready for that and take our seats for that particular briefing. We will of course bring it to you live, and perhaps we'll unpack that at the very end of of it to get a sense of what else will be happening. If you do have any thoughts in terms of how we've seen the developments over the past 2 days, please make sure you share those with us on our YouTube page. Please trust, we actually do read those. You may not believe it, but we do read those. So if you have any thoughts in terms of the program itself, the G20 presidency itself, the outcomes, your own expectations, at the end of the day, whether or not you think it will filter down to making any sort of difference, meaningful difference in your life, we are most certainly interested in hearing that as well. You're of course tuned in to EWN TV. Please do stay tuned as we continue to bring you the rest of the developments this afternoon. My name is Nogukhanya Mdambo. Please continue to watch your screens.
forum for international economic cooperation, and also ensuring that it continues to drive progress on our most important challenges. We have met this year, in fact the entire year. Meetings have taken place in our own country and elsewhere in the world, including at the United Nations, supporting the presidency of South Africa of the G20. And we've met in the face of significant challenges and demonstrated our ability to come together, even in the times of great difficulty, to pursue a better world. South Africa's presidency marks the first time, as we have said, that the G20 has been hosted and held on African soil. We are truly honored and humbled by that, not only as South Africans, but as Africans as a whole. Recognizing the importance of this milestone, we have sought to place Africa's growth and development interests at the heart of the G20's agenda. The greatest opportunity for prosperity in the 21st century lies in Africa. Harnessing that opportunity will require a rather strong partnership between Africa and the G20, and indeed between Africa and the rest of the world. Recognizing our interconnectedness as a global community of nations, we have called for an end to conflicts and wars around the globe and for a just and comprehensive and lasting peace. This summit has taken place at a crucial time as calls around the world grow louder for progress on the imperatives of our time, to end poverty in all its forms and ramifications, to reduce inequality within and amongst countries, and to take urgent action to combat climate change. This year, we have recognized the growing debt burden that is faced by many developing economy countries as a major obstacle to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. The G20 has pledged to extend support to low and middle income countries as they confront debt vulnerabilities. Together, we must create a virtuous cycle of reduced debt, higher public investment, and more rapid and inclusive economic growth. When we become more successful, all of us, then the whole world becomes successful. When we began our presidency, we pledged to mobilize the G20 to strengthen disaster resilience and response. Climate-induced natural disasters spare no country. Disasters know no borders. But their toll is heaviest on those without the means to recover and to rebuild. We therefore called on G20 leaders to urge the global community to scale up post-disaster reconstruction. In this regard, South Africa introduced the high-level voluntary principles for investing in disaster risk reduction and encouraged international collaboration to strengthen investment in preventing and responding to disasters. We've made progress in mobilizing finance for a just energy transition. Climate change touches every nation, but it impacts on everyone unevenly. That is why we have together pledged to increase the quality and the quantity of climate finance to developing economies, to strengthen multilateral development banks, to support country platforms like the Just Energy Transition Partnership and to unlock private capital. We reaffirmed our dedication to energy security, affordability and universal access, and the importance of supporting developing economies in their transition to low carbon emissions. We recognize the need for deep, rapid, and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and the need to substantially scale up investment and climate finance from all sources. During this summit, we reaffirmed our support for the G20 Critical Minerals Framework, a cooperative blueprint to ensure that critical minerals resources drive prosperity and sustainable development across the globe. Our presidency coincided with the end of the first cycle of the G20 presidencies. Following the mandate given to our presidency at the 2024 Rio de Janeiro Summit, we undertook the G20 at 20 review, drawing on the diverse perspectives of participating members and guest countries as well. It is our hope that the recommendations of the review will serve as a helpful guide for the G20 to ensure that it remains fit for purpose in an ever-changing world. In fact, the indicative report already says that the G20's existence should continue as it serves a good purpose in giving guidance to the economic well-being of the world. At the heart of our presidency lies a conviction that the G20 must act boldly and act together to create an environment of inclusive growth, an environment of reduced inequality, and an environment which will support sustainable development. South Africa has used this presidency to place the priorities of Africa and the Global South firmly at the heart of the G20 agenda. Building on the developmental agenda of previous presidencies in Indonesia, in India, and Brazil, we have prioritized the issues that matter most to developing economies. And in executing our task as a G20 president, we learned a lot from what Indonesia did, what India did, and what Brazil did. So in many ways, what we see having unfolded here was based on the foundations that those three countries of the Global South put in place. The G20 South Africa Summit Leaders Declaration is more than words. It is a commitment to concrete actions that will improve the lives of people in every part of the world. Our agreement on a declaration during this summit demonstrates the value of the G20 as a forum that can facilitate joint action on issues of shared concern. Shared concern not only for the leaders, but shared concern for the peoples of the world. More than that, it reaffirms our renewed commitment to multilateral cooperation and our recognition that our shared goals outweigh our differences. Together, we must accelerate progress towards the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations and the Pact for the Future. We have laid the foundation of solidarity. Now we must build the walls of justice and the roof of prosperity. Let us move forward together, demonstrating to the world that we do have the capacity to confront and overcome the world's challenges through partnerships across society, and by remembering our common humanity, we can create a more secure, a more just, and a more prosperous world. And together, we can ensure that no one is left behind. I now say that this gavel of this G20 summit formally closes this summit and now moves on to the next president of the G20, which is the United States, where we shall see each other again next year. The summit is therefore closed.
Hayi lo. Awuzi. Ngangiphorekile nje inyanga eyodwa. Ngangiphorekile inyanga eyodwa.
Hit the table with that gavel, so ended South Africa's tenure as presidency of the G20, and it goes over to the United States now. I should imagine a rather hostile White House looking at what's unfolded here. The fact that everything was signed off early morning yesterday and business meetings kicked off today. Bilateral, trilateral meetings, deals, and hoping that the continuation of this will expedite the issues that have been touched on and deal with those issues. And as the President was saying, it's been a wonderful platform to raise the voice of the South and to deal with debt issues and greenhouse issues, green emissions, and a whole lot of other topics that they have covered that we've certainly gone through, and we're all feeling very excited. And in fact, Malaika's been dancing with everybody else. It feels like a good ending, right?
It does. So we were just singing a song now, when the president hit the gavel, it says, Ramaphosa, re morata kaofela, re tsamaya le yena. That's so true. It means we all love Ramaphosa and we are going with him. So it's basically a song that speaks about trusting in the leadership of someone. And I think for many, many South Africans and many people really in the global South broadly, but across the world, we can all agree that whatever the limitations of South Africa as a country, even of Ramaphosa as a president, to this weekend, he demonstrated absolute leadership. And I think that's something that we can be proud of as a country, but as a continent as well.
And what an important time for the president and for the party, right? How's he going to capitalize on this, do you think?
Let's give him this moment and leave the party alone now.
Let's give him this moment. How's he going to capitalize on this?
Let's give him this moment. Let him revel in it. Yeah. He's still going to come back in December and deal with NGC stuff. So leave him, let him go. He had the gavel. It closed South Africa's G20 presidency. We have a week, I think, until the US takes it over. And I think for a moment, this is what South Africa does really well. We go through those moments of real depth and lowness, and we come up and we fight. So, you know what? To the world, we're still that strategic actor.
Yeah, and it's a case of Africa doesn't really need to wait to come to the big table anymore. We are here.
I mean, I think the president summed it very well yesterday in the opening of his presentation when he said that from Africa something new always comes. And I think Sanusha is putting it very well that we're quite a very resilient people. Very often in moments when you think South Africa is down and out, when it looks like we are being hit by tariffs, a lot of things are going wrong and so on, and you see this moment of leadership not only for us but when it's most needed in the world. But I think even for the European Union and other countries across the world, just 2 days ago, President Donald Trump unilaterally took a decision.
We're going to just stop for a moment. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkey president, is addressing the rest of us. So let's listen in.
Sizleri en kalbi duygularımla, saygıyla, sevgiyle selamlıyorum.
Distinguished members of the press, dear friends, I
G20 Liderler
extend my heartfelt
Zirvesi'ni
greetings to you all with respect.
Güney Afrika Cumhuriyeti'nin ev sahipliğinde tamamlamış bulunuyoruz. Dayanışma, eşitlik, sürdürülebilirlik ana temasıyla düzenlenen 20. zirvenin tüm insanlık için hayırlara vesile olmasını diliyorum.
We have just concluded the G20 Leaders Summit, graciously hosted by the Republic of South Africa. I hope that the 20th summit, held under the main theme of solidarity, equality, sustainability, will bring beneficial outcomes for all humanity.
Şahsıma, eşime ve heyetime gösterdikleri hüsnü kabul için Devlet Başkanı, değerli dostum Sayın Ramaphosa'ya teşekkür ediyorum.
I would like to express my gratitude to the President and my dear friend, Mr. Ramaphosa, for the warm welcome extended to me, my spouse, and my delegation.
G20 zirvesinin ilk defa Afrika'da tertiplenmesinden ayrıca memnuniyet duyuyoruz.
We are particularly pleased that the G20 summit has been convened in Africa for the first time.
Öncelikle bir hususu ifade etmek istiyorum.
Let me begin with an observation.
Zengin, kültürel, dini, etnik, sosyal dokusuyla gökkuşağı ülkesi sıfatını ziyadesiyle hak eden Güney Afrika Cumhuriyeti'ne ilk kez bundan tam 20 sene önce 2005 yılında başbakan olarak geldim.
I visited the Republic of South Africa, rightly known as the Rainbow Nation for its cultural, religious, ethnic, and social fabric, for the first time exactly 20 years ago in 2005 in my capacity as Prime Minister.
Akabinde 2011 senesinde yine başbakan, 2018 yılında ise BRICS zirvesi münasebetiyle Cumhurbaşkanı olarak bu güzel ülkeyi ziyaret etme fırsatı buldum.
I later had the opportunity to visit this beautiful country again in 2011 as Prime Minister and in 2018 as President on the occasion of the BRICS Summit.
Her ziyaretimde Güney Afrika'dan gerçekten güzel anılarla ayrıldım.
And each of these visits left me with truly fond memories.
Afrikalı dostlarımızın misafirperverliği, sıcaklığı, samimiyeti beni her zaman etkiledi. Gönül dünyamda silinmez izler bıraktı.
The hospitality, warmth, and sincerity of our South African friends have always impressed me and left an unforgettable mark on my heart.
Ülkemizde de farklı vesilelerle Güney Afrikalı dostlarımızı misafir ettik.
We in turn have hosted our South African friends in Turkey, in our country, on various occasions.
Ortak çabalarımız sayesinde münasebetlerimizde 20 yıl önce hayal dahi edilemeyen yerlere geldik.
Thanks to our joint efforts, our relations have reached levels that could not have been imagined 20 years ago.
Son olarak Devlet Başkan Yardımcısı Sayın Mashati ile ülkemizdeydi.
And most recently, Deputy President Mashatile was in our country.
Güney Afrika Cumhuriyeti ile hem hükümetler düzeyinde hem de ANC ile AK Partimiz arasında artan diyalog ve temasları önemsiyoruz.
We attach great importance to the growing dialogue and engagement between our governments, as well as between the ANC and our AK Party.
Türkiye olarak önümüzdeki dönemde de bu ivmeyi güçlendirerek devam ettirmek arzusundayız.
Turkey is determined to strengthen this positive momentum in the coming period.
Şurası bir gerçek ki Güney Afrika Cumhuriyeti'nin Sayın Nelson Mandela liderliğinde ırkçı apartheid rejimine karşı zaferi tüm dünyada adalet ve eşitlik arayışının en güçlü sembollerinden biri olmuştur.
It is an undeniable fact that the victory of the Republic of South Africa under the leadership of Nelson Mandela over the apartheid regime has become one of the strongest symbols of the global quest for justice and equality.
Güney Afrika'nın Filistin davasına yıllardır verdiği ilkeli ve sarsılmaz desteği bu bakımdan çok kıymetli buluyorum.
And in this context, I greatly value South Africa's principled and unwavering support for the Palestinian cause over the years.
Özellikle çoğu çocuk, kadın ve sivil 70 bin Filistinlinin şehit edildiği Gazze soykırımında Güney Afrika örnek bir duruş sergiledi.
In particular, during the genocide in Gaza, where 70,000 Palestinians, most of them children, women, and civilians were massacred, South Africa displayed exemplary resolve.
Tüm dünyanın gözleri önünde Gazze'de insanlığa karşı suç işlenirken tıpkı Türk milleti gibi Güney Afrikalı dostlarımız da vahşete sırtını dönmedi.
As crimes against humanity were committed in Gaza before the eyes of the world, our South African friends, like the Turkish people, did not turn their backs on this brutality.
Uluslararası Adalet Divanı'nda İsrail aleyhine açtıkları soykırım davasıyla yürekli bir tavır takınan Güney Afrika Devleti'ni, toplumunu, yöneticilerini tebrik ediyor, ülkem ve milletim adına saygıyla selamlıyorum.
I commend the South African state, its people, and its leaders who courageously filed a genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. And I salute them on behalf of my nation, my people.
Türkiye olarak biz de kimseden çekinmeden Filistin davasına çok güçlü biçimde sahip çıktık. Her platformda Gazze'li mazlumların hak ve hukukunu cesaretle savunduk.
Turkey too has fearlessly stood by the Palestinian cause, defending the rights of the oppressed people of Gaza at every platform.
103 bin tonu aşan insani yardımlarımızla Gazze'li kardeşlerimizin yanında olduk.
With over 103,000 tons of humanitarian assistance, we have supported our Palestinian brothers and sisters.
Şimdi bildiğiniz gibi bizim de katkılarımızla bir ateşkes sağlandı.
As you know, a ceasefire has now been achieved also with our contributions, among others.
Biz çatışma ortamına tekrar dönülmemesi için üzerimize ne düşüyorsa yapıyoruz.
We spare no efforts to prevent a return to conflict again.
Gazze'de yaşanan yıkımın neticelerinin mümkün mertebe hafifletilmesinin küresel bir sorumluluk olduğunu vurguladım. İnsani yardımlar ve yeniden imara destek istedim.
And during our summit, I emphasized that mitigating the consequences of the destruction in Gaza is a global responsibility, and I called for humanitarian aid and support for reconstruction.
Tabii bu noktada sağlanan ateşkesin devamını temin ederken kalıcı çözüm için iki devletli formülün hayata geçirilmesi büyük önem arz ediyor.
Of course, while ensuring the continuation of the ceasefire, it is of paramount importance to implement the two-state solution for a lasting settlement.
1967 sınırları temelinde başkenti Doğu Kudüs olan özgür bir Filistin devleti kurulmadan küresel barış tam manasıyla sağlanamaz.
A free state of Palestine, based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, is essential to achieve true global peace.
Mazlum Filistin halkı ile birlikte tüm bölgemizin ve insanlığın barışı, huzuru, güvenliği için bu konudaki ilkeli tutumumuzu muhafaza edeceğiz.
We will continue to uphold our principled stance for the peace, stability, and security of both the oppressed Palestinian people and our entire region and humanity.
Değerli basın mensupları, bu yılda G20 faaliyetlerine aktif olarak iştirak ettik. Uluslararası gündeme katkıda bulunmayı sürdürdük. Değerli basın mensupları, bu yılda G20
Distinguished members of the
faaliyetlerine
press,
aktif olarak
as has been the case, this year we actively participated in G20 activities and continued contributing to the international agenda.
zirve kapsamında yaptığım hitaplarda ülkemizin iklim değişikliğiyle mücadele, yeşil dönüşüm, sürdürülebilir kalkınma ve teknolojik ilerlemelerin kalkınma politikalarına etkisine dair görüşlerimizi aktardım.
In my interventions during the summit, I conveyed our views on climate change, the green transition, sustainable development, and the impact of technological progress on development policies.
Bilhassa en az gelişmiş ülkelerin Birleşmiş Milletler 2030 sürdürülebilir kalkınma hedeflerinde geri kalmaması için ihtiyaç duydukları mali desteğin teminine dikkat çektik.
We particularly highlighted the urgent need to mobilize financial support required by the least developed countries so that they are not left behind in achieving the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals.
Zirve vesilesiyle ayrıca G20'nin bugüne kadarki çalışmalarının bir muhasebesini yaptık.
The summit also allowed us to assess the progress made by the G20 so far.
Katılımcı diğer liderlerle ikili görüşmeler gerçekleştirdik. Önemli konularda istişarelerde bulunduk.
I also held bilateral meetings with the other participating leaders and exchanged our views on issues of global concern.
Bu çerçevede Dün ve bugün aralarında Avustralya, Kanada, Angola, Etiyopya, Fransa, Brezilya, Malezya, İtalya ve Singapur devlet ve hükümet başkanlarının olduğu birçok liderin yanı sıra Birleşmiş Milletler Genel Sekreteri ve Avrupa Birliği Komisyon Başkanı ve bazı uluslararası kuruluş temsilcileriyle görüşmelerimiz oldu.
In this context, over the past 2 days, I met with many leaders, including those of Australia, Canada, Angola, Ethiopia, France, Brazil, Malaysia, Italy, Singapore, as well as the United Nations Secretary General and the President of the European Commission. And also I met with representatives of other international organizations.
Değerli basın mensupları, G20 birçok farklı ülkeyi bünyesinde barındıran ve temsil niteliği yüksek bir platform olmayı sürdürüyor.
Dear members of the press, the G20 continues to be a platform of broad representation, bringing together many diverse nations.
Ben de 2008 yılından bu yana G20 zirvelerine bizzat katılıyorum.
I have been personally participating in G20 summits since 2008.
G20'nin mevcut ve müstakbel küresel sınamalara karşı uluslararası topluma liderlik etmesi bizler için mühimdir.
It is crucial that the G20 provides leadership to the international community in addressing current and future global challenges.
Bu yılki zirvemizde de kimseyi geride bırakmama şiarının uluslararası toplumun pusulası olması gerektiğini bir kez daha vurguladık.
At this year's summit, we reiterated that the principle of leaving no one behind must serve as the compass of the international community.
Kimsenin geride bırakılmadığı, daha kapsayıcı ve dayanıklı bir küresel ekonomi inşa edilmesi gerekliliğini dile getirdik.
We underscored the need to build a more inclusive and resilient global economy in which no one is left behind.
Uluslararası işbirliğinin ve çok taraflılığın önemini vurguladık.
We stressed the importance of international cooperation and multilateralism.
Bu yıl ayrıca Meksika, Endonezya, Kore Cumhuriyeti ve Avustralya ile birlikte kurduğumuz MIKTA'nın 12. kuruluş yıl dönümünü idrak ediyoruz.
This year also marks the 12th anniversary of MIKTA Group, which we established together with Mexico, Indonesia, the Republic of Korea and Australia.
Zirve vesilesiyle MIKTA liderleri olarak dönem başkanı Kore Cumhuriyeti'nin ev sahipliğinde bir araya geldik. Ortak bir basın açıklaması yayımladık.
On the margins of the summit, the MIKTA leaders convened under the chairmanship of the Republic of Korea and issued a joint press statement.
Basın açıklamasında çok taraflılığa bağlılığımızı yeniden teyit ettik.
And in that statement, we reaffirmed our commitment to multilateralism.
Hepsi aynı zamanda G20 üyesi olan MIKTA ülkeleriyle işbirliğimizi önümüzdeki dönemde daha da güçlendireceğiz.
We will further strengthen our cooperation with our MIKTA partners, all of whom are also G20 members, in the forthcoming period.
G20 Johannesburg zirvesi süresince gerçekleştirdiğimiz istişarelerin küresel ekonomik ve siyasi istikrar için hayırlı sonuçlara kapı aralamasını temenni ediyorum.
I hope that the consultations we held throughout the G20 Johannesburg Summit will pave the way for positive outcomes for global economic and political stability.
G20 dönem başkanlığını 1 Aralık 2025 tarihinden itibaren devralacak olan Amerika Birleşik Devletleri'ne şimdiden başarılar diliyorum.
Taking this opportunity, I also wish the success to the United States of America, which will assume the G20 presidency as of the 1st of December 2025.
Sizleri bir kez daha sevgiyle, saygıyla selamlıyorum. Teşekkür ediyorum. Kalın sağlıcakla.
Once again, I greet you all with respect and thank you very much.
After G20, what can you say about Russia, and maybe this is G20 can be better relationships with Turkey and Russia? And what can you say now, Putin?
Teşekkürler. G20 zirvesinden hemen sonra Rusya ile ilgili ne söyleyebilirsiniz? Türkiye-Rusya ilişkilerinden dolayı G20 ve Rusya arasında daha iyi ilişkiler olabilir mi? Ve son olarak Putin ile ilgili neler söyleyebilirsiniz?
Bu hafta içerisinde Sayın Zelenski misafirimdi. Yarın da Sayın Putin'le bir telefon görüşmem olacak. Tabii bu arada buradaki ikili görüşmelerde Rusya, Ukrayna.
Let's leave the Turkish president there, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who's really capitalizing on the success of this G20 to deflect from the many problems that he is experiencing at home. Talking about us and home in South Africa, we have a rare opportunity to celebrate something that has been pulled off with aplomb. Us together with the president should be reveling in this moment. What South Africa has managed to do is secure a declaration, the first declaration on African soil, the first G20 summit held on African soil. It's put South Africa firmly in the spotlight, and it's a message that Africa does not have to wait to come to the table, doesn't have to wait to be invited to the table, the big table. Africa is already there. And from me, Jane Dutton, and the EWN team, thank you very much for joining us. Now it goes over to the United States from the 1st of December.